Hi, this video is on adaptation, which plays a very important part in evolution. That is, how do adaptive mutations, alleles, etc. affect the evolution of organisms. Adaptation includes a trait or integrated suite of traits that increases the fitness of the organism in a process called adaptation. So adaptation is a trait of an organism enabling it to survive or reproduce in its current natural environment, usually better than if it lacked the trait. And then adaptation can be a physical feature, function, or behavior produced in the past by natural selection. It can also be a gene that performs a certain function that makes that organism more likely to survive in a particular environment. Several scientists have attempted to define this in different ways. So the first is an adaptation is a phenotypic variant that results in the highest fitness among a specified set of variants in a given gene environment. Fair enough. Historical, for a character to be regarded as an adaptation, it must be a derived character that evolved in response to a specific selective agent. And then this last one, a feature that fortuitously serves a new function. That is, it wasn't predestined to do that, but it happened to perform an adaptive or positive fitness function in the environment, or characters evolved for other functions or none at all that have been co-opted for a new use. And we talked about this a little bit in a previous video on multi-gene families. Specifically, I'm talking about the flagellar genes in bacteria, which originally evolved for different purposes, but then through time and evolution evolved into a bacterial flagellum. For example, here's one which is an adaptation by young wolves and dogs as well to be submissive by licking and begging for food. So in this way, they get food without actually having to hunt many times. This also is important to the adult that also gets some benefit out of feeding the young as well. So how is adaptation studied? How to determine if a trait is an adaptation? So first is to determine what the trait is for and not what it seems to be for. That is, color in mice or camouflage, etc. Secondly is look at variation in the traits that results from a response to the environment. And third, significant association between the trait and fitness. Is there an association there? So 3 methods have been used to study adaptive traits. 1 is experiments, 2 is observational studies, and 3 is by comparative methods. And I should also mention by sequencing the DNA, RNA, or proteins, and then looking at comparisons of different sequences that have similar or sometimes different functions. So experiments have been performed by putting a mouse, paramyscus mice, in either light soil or dark soil, and then looking at the number of attacks by predators. So if you put a white mouse and a dark mouse on a sand, a lighter colored sand, then there are more attacks on the dark colored mouse than on the light colored mouse. But if you put the mice in a darker or mixed environment, then there are more attacks on the white mouse than on the dark mouse that looks like it's in shadows. And what might happen in the future evolutionarily is white mice will evolve to larger populations of white mice will appear in the light colored background, and larger populations of black mice will appear in the shaded regions, and then they can actually speciate from there. Here's another example where they wondered whether the pattern or the behavior, or both, of this fly had any effect on spiders that have a waving type of display also, which was a territorial threat, waving by the spiders. So the question was, are these behaviors and the color pattern responsible for the adaptation that leads to fewer attacks on the fly by these spiders? So here's the experiment where in A, they have an untreated fly, that is a normal fly with normal wings. The second one was where they have the wings cut off and reattached, just to see if the process of breaking the wings off had any effect. And then the third one, they have the same fly, but this time it has a plain wing, not a wing that looks like a spider, and those were glued on. And then they took a housefly and put on the spider-looking wings, and finally an untreated housefly with normal wings, and then looked at how many attacks by spiders occurred. So three predictions were made. One, that there is no mimicry. So that means no matter what treatment they do, the spiders will attack. The second hypothesis is that the mimicry deters other predators, but not the jumping spiders. So then you would see other predators retreating when they saw the normal fly or the fly with the normal wings. And the third hypothesis was that mimicry deters the jumping spiders. And so in that case, the jumping spiders would retreat when they saw the fly with the spider-like wings and the movement of the legs, which mimicked a territorial display by the spider. And here are the results. So jumping spider responses are on the left. And so a fully intact fly, or a fly that had the wing clipped off and then glued back on, plus it had the leg movement, which was a threat display, deterred the most jumping spiders. All of the other treatments did not deter the jumping spider. So the fly without the spider-like wings, and the fly with the house fly with the spider-like wings attached, but it doesn't have the leg movement territorial display, and then just a housefly. So in all of the cases, the jumping spiders attacked. The only cases where they did not attack was where the fly with the spider-like wings and the spider-like behavior were present. So then both adaptations, the wings that mimicked the spider legs and the behavior of moving the legs in a display that looks like a territorial display by a spider, had the effect of deterring the jumping spider predators. So here's an example of an observational study, and this is thermoregulation in garter snakes in Northern California. Unlike mammals, snakes do not control their body temperature. They do that by moving into and out of the sun or warm or cold areas. So how do they solve this problem of not getting too hot but not getting too cold? They were able to put radio transmitters on the snakes, and then they observed their behavior, whether they were under a rock or exposed, and found that they maintained their body temperature by moving either under the rock at night to maintain their heat by using some of the heat from the rock, or during the day, if they were too cold, they would get out into the sun to warm them up. If their body temperature maintained fairly well under the rock, then they would stay under the rock, and that's shown by snake number 2 on the right. They also measured the temperatures of different rocks. That is, a thin rock, there was much greater of a temperature range And then there was a medium rock where there was some temperature range around a median. And then under a thick rock, there was less temperature change in those rocks. And they found that the snakes were almost always under the medium rock, and they would just move from one place on the rock or under the rock to another place under the rock to where the temperature most suited them. So by sensing the different temperatures in the rock and through experience, then most of the snakes gravitated towards medium-sized rocks. They also measured temperatures inside the den of the snake, as well as on the surface, either exposed or shaded regions, and found that the den temperatures maintained a more or less steady temperature. They would only come out when it got too cold, and if it got too hot, they could go back down into the den to maintain their temperature. And this table indicates their preference for rock size. So although in each case they gave them about a 33, one-third rocks were thin, one-third of them were medium, one-third of them were thick, the snakes clearly preferred the medium rocks, and secondarily the thicker rocks. The thin rocks, which got too hot during the day and too cold at night, were not preferred by the snakes. Another adaptation has been testes size in bats and other mammals, for that matter. And these are observational studies. So in some species of bats, they have larger testes in relation to their body size. And the reason is that if you do a phylogenetic study comparing species of bats, there's a correlation between the size of social groups, where females mate with more than one male, and male testes size. And this happens with primates also. So body size versus testes mass here, and in blue here are females that mate with only one male, so there are fewer copulations in general. And then females likely to copulate with more than one partner, and that's in red here. So humans are up here, sort of below the dividing line, and normally human males mate with one female, or possibly a few more than that, but on average about one. If you look at the case in gorillas, their testes sizes are even smaller than humans, and if you look at bonobos and chimps that copulate very often, their testes sizes are much larger in relation to their body size than in humans. There's also phenotypic plasticity, which shouldn't be confused with adaptations. What it is the organisms have a certain degree of variation within each individual. So their morphologies can change somewhat in different environments. And here's one example where there's a change in a particular carp, which can change due to different amounts of predation by this predator pike. And so in some lakes, it will be larger, which will ensure that it's not attacked as successfully as the smaller version when the number of predators in those lakes is higher. Here's another example of phenotypic plasticity in Daphnia, which is a small crustacean, an aquatic microscopic animal. So they had two different populations or genotypes of these small Daphnia. One line had been never exposed to fish or the smell of fish, so they had no knowledge that the fish were predators, and those are the red dots. And the other ones are ones that had been exposed to fish and knew that the fish could try to eat them. So in one lake that had a lot of fish, and then they took the fish out, so it still had the smell of fish. The controls that had never been exposed to fish moved higher in the water column toward the light, whereas the ones that were fish-induced, they'd had experience with fish before, they moved lower in the water column. And a similar thing happened in the second lake, although not to the same degree, after they removed the fish. So there were a few fish there, there was fish smell, then they moved lower in the water column. Whereas in a lake with no fish, so there was no fish odor, then both the controls and the fish-induced individuals rose to about the same level in the water column. In a similar experiment, they used the same pond, the same lake, and early on the pond had no fish. So whether they were fish-induced or not fish-induced, they rose to about the same level in the pond. Then from 1976 to 79, they stocked the lake with fish that would eat the Daphnia, and the individuals that had not been exposed to fish before rose higher in the column than those that had been exposed to fish before and knew that these were predators. And finally, by 1988, there were fewer fish in the pond, so whether the Daphnia had been exposed to fish or not exposed to fish, they rose to about the same level in the pond, but it was a little lower than the original 1970-1972 populations. So over the years, after it was heavily stocked, there was a general change in the behavior of the populations of those Daphnia. So there are some factors that limit adaptation, and one is the lack of genetic variation. So if we look at this equation, R equals H squared S, that is, the response to natural selection is related to H squared, which is essentially the heritability of a particular trait, times S, which is whether there's selection acting on it or not. So if heritability is high and selection is high, then the response will be also a large value. And the converse of that is if heritability and selection are low, then there will be almost no response. So essentially this is saying if there's not much variation within the population, then adaptation will be low also. The second are evolutionary trade-offs, that is, compromises among competing demands. So just as we talked about the sexual selection, that is, a brightly colored male bird attracts more predators as well as more mates. It depends on which one of those two factors predominates as to whether the male will have a lot of plumage and pass those on to its offspring or not. And third are their evolutionary constraints, that is, restrictions or limitations on the outcome of adaptive evolution. So there can be functional constraints based on whatever the trait is, developmental constraints, and phylogenetic constraints. So as far as functional constraints, let's say a duck or some bird can avoid predators by becoming larger, but then it can't fly as well because it's heavier. So there are some constraints on how large that bird can become. So in every case, and in essence then, all changes are not equally possible. And so all adaptations are not equally possible. So one constraint is the lack of genetic variation. So there are some leaf beetles that can shift from one host plant species to another, but there are others that lack the variation to do so. So down here, some of these species are capable of growing on more than one species, and some on many species, whereas a few up here can only grow on a single species and cannot adapt to living on a different host species. And then these are examples of some evolutionary trade-offs. In begonia flowers, the female flower can be larger and actually attracts more pollinators. However, as it produces larger and larger flowers, it actually produces fewer flowers. So there's a trade-off as to attracting pollinators versus how many flowers to pollinate to make seeds. So down here in Drosophila melanogaster, you can select for reduced developmental time, that is, how long it takes to become an adult. But that also reduces the lifespan of the individual, so there's another trade-off. And there also are evolutionary constraints. So an evolutionary constraint may help to explain why something did not evolve. That is, why didn't elephants evolve to have wings, or humans for that matter? And why couldn't arthropods evolve to be as large as elephants? Why was that not possible? So there are many constraints as to evolutionary pathways in different types of organisms. Another way to put this is that while there are many different evolutionary pathways available, the number of pathways is not unlimited. Not everything can happen. Here's an example of an evolutionary constraint. On the left, that's a phylogenetic tree of doves, and so you can see how they have speciated. And then on the right-hand side is a phylogram of the body feather lice, and you'll notice it's that both are congruent. That is, they show that when the doves split into new species, the lice also went with them. And so there's been an evolutionary constraint in that the lice have followed along with the species of doves as they speciated. So for some reason, some evolutionary reason, some functional reason, the lice are pretty much locked in with evolving with their host species, except in one case where you see a little bit of crossing of the lines up above. Here's what would happen if there were incongruence, that is, if there were no evolutionary constraints on where the lice could live. And so you have the doves on the left-hand side and the phylogenetic tree for the wing lice, and you can see that they seem to be associated with one or more species, and that the evolutionary patterns are very different, so that there's incongruence in this case. So as far as evolution of the feather lice, as to which host they're on, there are no evolutionary constraints in this case. So now I want to talk about one bird that's been studied to a great extent with regard to adaptation. And it's a bar-headed goose that flies long distances at high altitudes. It actually flies over the Himalayas. Here's a flock of bar-headed geese. They're sort of a medium-sized goose with very efficient lungs and circulatory systems for flying over the Himalayas. This shows their migration route from southern India up over the Himalayan mountains and the Tibetan plateau, and then into Mongolia, where they spend their spring and summer mating, and then fly south again for the winter back into India. Over here you can see the altitudes that they have to reach. In India, they're fairly low altitudes, and then they have to go way up over the Himalayas into the Tibetan plateau, and at times they're up to 5,000 to 6,000 meters, which is nearly 20,000 feet, and then down into Mongolia, a slightly lower area, down to where they mate around 2,000 to 3,000 meters. Still fairly high, but much lower than the Himalayas. So this shows a comparison of some of the birds and other things that are at either low altitude or high altitude. So Canada geese and other birds are usually at their highest are between 3 and 10,000 feet. So the Canada goose, you can look down here as a comparison with the bar-headed goose. The bar-headed goose can actually go up to nearly 30,000 feet, which is well over 6 to 7,000 meters. And only one other bird can fly even higher than that. But the 30,000 feet is about the height of a conventional jet aircraft, which fly usually between 32 and 35,000 feet. And not only is the air very thin at that height, but it's very cold. If you've ever flown transcontinental and you go up to 35,000 feet, usually you look, sometimes they have a temperature gauge and you're down around minus 30 to sometimes minus 50 degrees. Here's a graph relating those two. So at the surface, you can be 20 degrees Celsius, and by the time you reach about 5,000 meters, it's down to minus 10 to minus 20. And then as you go higher, up to, say, 7,000 or 8,000 meters, the temperature drops to around minus 40. So as they cross the Himalayas, they're well below zero at those heights. One behavior or strategy, I guess, but earlier behavior that helps them is that if you look at their flight path, they actually stay fairly close to the ground during their flights. And so they're only exposed to the very cold temperatures once they reach the very top of the Himalayan mountains. And so they only do that for a short time during their crossing of the Himalayas from India up to Mongolia. So you can see by the time in hours up here, they're really only spending about 2 hours in the very coldest temperatures. But they also are using their flight muscles to a great degree, so that's actually keeping their bodies warm, although they're using a lot of energy at that altitude. In addition to the cold temperatures, then the amount of oxygen available at those high altitudes drops by quite a bit. So at sea level, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 150 millimeters of mercury. By the time you reach the top of Mount Everest, it's down below 50. So it's dropped by more than 2/3. And so even people that climb Mount Everest need to have supplemental oxygen in many cases, or they get sick and die up there. So over a long period of time, the geese have had to adapt to these severe conditions in order to reach their breeding grounds in Mongolia. And you might ask, how did this condition evolve where they had to go over the Himalayan mountains? They started this migration millions of years ago as birds that flew over relatively low mountains. But about 10 million years ago, the Indian subcontinent bumped into the Eurasian plate and started pushing under it. And in doing so, it pushed up the Himalayan mountains. And each year the mountains got higher and higher and higher. So the bar-headed geese had to either adapt to those conditions year after year after year, or go extinct. And they're not raising, the Himalayas aren't raising to any great extent. It's like a foot or a part of a foot every year, but they are increasing in height. So every year their flight over the Himalayas becomes just a bit higher than it was the year before. But over 7 to 10 million years ago, till now, the Himalayas have gone up a great deal. And so the geese have had a long time to evolve and adapt to the increasingly severe conditions. So some of the physiology and other factors have been compared between the bar-headed goose that flies over the Himalayas and gray-lag geese and pink-footed geese that live constantly at low altitudes. And just for comparison, there's the Canada goose down at the bottom. So through these comparisons, they've discovered some of the physiological adaptations that have occurred in the bar-headed geese to allow them to fly over the Himalayas. So one of the differences in bar-headed geese from gray-lag geese is some mutations in the alpha and beta globin genes in hemoglobin. And we already talked about hemoglobin in a previous video with respect to the ability to carry oxygen. And so you could expect that the bar-headed goose, its hemoglobin will carry oxygen under lower oxygen concentrations, which is true. That's what it does. So there are three specific mutations that occurred in bar-headed geese. Instead of a glycine, alanine, proline in these three positions, there's now a serine, valine, alanine, which allows then a change in the alpha globin chain so that it picks up oxygen more readily than the hemoglobin, the alpha, in the gray-lag geese. And gray-lag geese have a different mutation also. Instead of a threonine aspartic acid within the beta globin chain, which is found in the bar-headed geese, they have a serine glutamic acid pair. So again, that causes a change in the affinity for oxygen, for the beta globin in this case. So here is a graph showing at different oxygen partial pressures, that is the essentially the concentration of oxygen in the air, and then the amount of oxygen saturation. So in essence, both of these curves show that at the same oxygen pressure, that the hemoglobin in the bar-headed goose would pick up oxygen to a greater extent than would the hemoglobin in either Canada goose or in duck. And down here, these are just showing the alpha and beta subunits and where some of the changes are between the bar-headed goose and the gray-lag goose. And one particular association between a leucine and, in this case, a proline versus an alanine in the bar-headed goose allows the structure of the globin to open up a bit and to be better able to attach the oxygen to the heme group in that globin. So that is one adaptation that has occurred to allow the bar-headed geese to fly over the Himalayas. Their hemoglobin can pick up oxygen to a greater extent under low oxygen conditions than other birds. Another molecule that was examined in bar-headed geese is cytochrome oxidase, which is one of the enzymes within the oxidative phosphorylation chain within the mitochondria. And this is where this is the molecule that then is important in taking the oxygen with electrons and protons and joining that with water to move protons across the membrane to encourage those protons and wind up going through ATP synthase to make ATP, or converting that into chemical energy in the form of ATP. And what was found was the cytochrome oxidase was more efficient at converting oxygen and the protons and the electrons into water, so that it would actually produce more ATP than you would find in other types of geese. So this was a second adaptation. So it can carry more oxygen in the blood or pick it up at lower oxygen pressures, and it can use that oxygen more efficiently to make ATP. And other studies showed other adaptations in this bird. One is insensitivity of brain blood vessels to low CO2, also a higher affinity in the blood for O2, which I've already mentioned because of the different hemoglobin. Large hearts with highly capillarized muscle, so a lot more capillaries feeding oxygen to the heart. They had larger lungs, thin, strong membranes for better gas exchange within the lungs. And then they had additional air sacs in their lungs to store breathed in gases, including oxygen. And then abundant mitochondria, which increases the rate of oxidative phosphorylation in general. And then highly capillarized flight muscles, so you're feeding more oxygen to those flight muscles too, especially in low oxygen conditions. And changes in metabolic O2 utilization, that is the cytochrome oxidase in those mitochondria, and then a high ventilation rate and effective breathing pattern, so they would really breathe in a lot of gas with each breath, and not only part of that went to the lungs, but it also went to those additional air sacs. So during those millions of years of evolution, as the Himalayas were becoming higher and higher, and the birds had to go to higher and higher levels, elevations, each one of these small adaptations was occurring to allow certain birds to cross the Himalayas, probably the ones that had variants or mutants that did not have some of those adaptations were not able to make the crossing and were not able to reproduce. But of the ones that finally made it, they contain all of these adaptations that allowed for this adaptive evolution in these birds. And I really find this amazing that they can survive such a trip going over the Himalayas in one direction and then coming back with their young in the other direction. So quite an amazing adaptive evolutionary story. Okay, so that's the end of this video on adaptation in evolution. Thanks very much, and I will talk to you later.